Dr. Manning, could you give us your input regarding the topic of disclosure?
Well, disclosure is sort of a multi-pronged process. Its impact on an individual and people around an individual is profound. And we sort of divide that impact into two categories. One we would call the benefits of disclosure, and the other would be the cost of disclosure. On the benefits side of disclosing, and again, this can come in various ways we'll talk about in just a moment, but on the benefit side of disclosure is the idea of living transparently and not hiding with mental illness. You can be more open about the experiences you're having, the feelings that you're having. You can find someone who's empathetic and be able to disclose about day-to-day issues that come up. It's a lack of loneliness, a sense of I'm in this with others aware and with others who are also impacted by these conditions, can be incredibly freeing and empowering. Finding a peer with an experience in that realm is not particularly difficult if you begin looking for and approaching these conversations in a trusting relationship. And so those are people who can provide assistance to you and you can provide assistance to them. And this sense of personal power as a living testimony, sort of an existential hero kind of role, the idea of I am running against the herd. Everyone else is hiding, but I'm not going to hide because I know that hiding robs me of my life, robs me of power, and frankly, robs others of what my life can benefit to them. So those are all on the side of why people might disclose. On the other side is that some people don't understand, won't understand, and there are risks of social ostracism and gossip that are certainly horribly stigmatizing. There can be, although it would be against the law, there can be discrimination, subtle discrimination, but discrimination nonetheless in employment, housing, job opportunities, opportunities in joining and participating in other social groups. The fear of being misunderstood increases the stigma and this, for some people, the preoccupation that others can see through you and see the difficulty, or making fun of you, or thinking badly of you, or who are pitying you, even unnecessarily pitying you. And again, the idea of, this is very often a false idea, that you're constantly being watched for evidence of an illness is a cost of disclosure. If you've begun to disclose and then you were to have an episode of illness, you might find people watching that as a reason to stigmatize, as a reason to get the wrong idea of what you're going through. And this is particularly common in family groups, sadly. You can think about benefits and costs in these kinds of ways. So there are strategies for self-disclosure. One strategy that's used more than we would like for it to be used is the strategy of social avoidance. Some people will essentially avoid people, places, and persons where they think disclosure might be possible. And again, that's very sad because social phobia is very often a comorbid condition. Some people just don't avoid people, but keep the fact that they have a mental illness or have a mental health condition a secret. That might be at work or in faith places such as churches, synagogues, mosques, that sort of thing. Other people indiscriminately disclose, almost like having or wearing their history of mental health issues as a badge of honor, swinging around a club, hiding it from no one. It certainly gets the message out, but perhaps not as thoughtfully as other strategies. And then there is an intentional, thoughtful strategy where that's called broadcasting, where one is intentionally thoughtful about who and when and where they make disclosures and become transparent. And they will test the waters to make sure that the way is clear and that the people that they are disclosing to are empathetic and willing to listen. So when one is embracing the power of self-disclosure, the National Alliance on Mental Illness has an entire series of presentations called In Our Own Voice, which are intended to change attitudes and assumptions and ideas about these conditions and the individuals who are living with them. These presentations provide personal perspectives, such as the personal perspective that we're helping give our listeners today. And as leaders with lived experiences, talking openly is one of the best things we can do to inform others. The Depression Bipolar Support Alliance has a program called I'm Living, and it's really pointed at teenage individuals who are beginning a journey, experiencing mood disorders particularly, and it's a message of hope. There is hope. You're living proof that there's hope. I'm living proof that there's hope. Mental Health America has a feels like section that encourages individuals not to keep mental illness to yourself, because there is, as we've mentioned a couple of times before, power in sharing. Paul, what about that feels like program from Mental Health America do you think you'd like to share more about?
Well, we were founded by an individual with lived experience, Clifford Beers. And what we say about Clifford Beers 110 years ago when he founded the modern mental health advocacy movement, in all the organizations can trace their roots to him, was this clarion call he offered, which was, I must fight in the open. Brian, I think you're going to talk a little bit more now and can for us about people being more than their diagnosis. So let's turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. At this point, I would like to introduce a resource to the audience that is currently available to all who are registered members of PsychU. Within the PsychU Patients and Caregivers section resides the More Than My Diagnosis resource. And this section includes video interviews of individuals who either live with mental health issues or care for someone who does. And they share helpful personal insights, reminding everyone that a diagnosis does not define a person. So I would encourage all the attendees of today's program to explore, to share, and utilize the More Than My Diagnosis resource on PsychU. Now let's get back to our presentation and hear more from Caroline.
After you have shared with others information regarding your condition, what were their reactions or thoughts?
One that comes to mind first is one of my brothers high-fived me after I sent that email. I think as a way of saying, like, hey, you put that information out there, good job. But it actually kind of made me feel minimized. And I've had other friends, kind of say, but you don't act crazy. Or, but you don't act this way. You don't act that way. I don't see a mood disorder in you. And so I have to sit there and justify and explain myself to people, which is extremely frustrating. So the few people that have responded really well that come to mind are my parents and my husband. So yeah.
Okay. And have you ever felt that you were stigmatized due to your mental health condition from anyone?
I would say that in social work field placements that I've had, I have heard people say, well, a social worker with a mental illness couldn't do this job. Or a social worker with a mental health issue couldn't do this job. And that is really frustrating to me because even though I may need mental health days and I may need breaks, I also need understanding. And I have felt like I haven't gotten that before. And I have also felt stigmatized when friends make jokes about people with mental health issues. when they make jokes about crazy people or, people who are psycho or stuff like that. It really hits me the wrong way.
And do you correct them, or do you attempt to advise them of their coarse types of comments, or do you just let it go?
I attempt to correct them now. I used to not. When I was first diagnosed, I just let it go because, it hurt, but I just let it go because I was still trying to understand my own diagnosis myself. But now I am really trying to make myself be in the habit of saying, hey, you know what? Like, that's actually not a kind word to use. And I have bipolar disorder and I wouldn't call myself that. And would you call me that? And I've literally disclosed my bipolar disorder to people in that way when they say something stigmatizing, which is shocking to them. It really catches them off guard, but I don't feel bad doing that because they're stigmatizing people. So that's been a big thing that I've recently started to do, is calling people out when they need to be called out.
Paul, after hearing Caroline describe her personal experience with stigma and mental health, could you now continue our discussion with regards to different types of stigma?
Sure, Brian, I'd be happy to. And thank you for giving us that insight via Carolyn in the first place. Stigma does take many forms. And here we've been talking till now about the importance of self-disclosure, about the importance of taking ownership, of the importance of fighting in the open. But so many people do experience a form of stigma when they do attempt to do this. And it's important for all of us to address this. Stigma in the United States healthcare system contributes to negative attitudes about people, to beliefs about mental illness, and to the behaviors of healthcare providers and others toward people with mental health disorders. And stigma really can take three different forms for the most part for most people. One is this public stigma. Some of the things that Sloan's been touching on, the fears that people have about how individuals will react to them if they disclose, whether it's a family member, whether it's another employee in the workplace, whether it's somebody in their church or somebody in their social circles. There is a public stigma to this. There is, as a result of that, some self-stigma that goes on too. Many people who simply feel shame in a way they wouldn't feel shame about another physical health diagnosis. And there is then structural stigma that's built into our system generally. And a lot of us really don't talk as much about stigma being at the foundation or the root of all of this, but in structural stigma, use that as an opportunity to talk about discrimination, true discrimination that occurs. And the stigma is really an effect of the discrimination that sometimes people are subjected to as a result of having a chronic condition which is simply treated differently from the way we treat other chronic conditions, not as a public health or a chronic care concern, but as a public safety concern. From the first person perspective, people see many attitudes and routine experiences or practices within healthcare settings in particular, but other settings as well, that can be experienced as both in their minds discriminatory, but certainly stigmatizing. And specifically, mental health care consumers have reported feeling stigmatized by such things as a lack of interest in them and their mental health history. So when they're being queried about their health history, they're not being queried to the same extent about their mental health history. They're stigmatized by being held to a standard psychiatric treatment. And all too frequently, people recognize that, we all recognize that one size does not fit all. And in many instances, we've been moving in all areas of healthcare to more personalized medicine. Too many people in our space feel as if when they're seeing healthcare professionals, it's a one-size-fits-all solution to which they're being subjected, being diagnosed in a way that conveys an expectation of negative prognosis. One of the really important things Sloan said right at the beginning of this particular podcast and webinar was that it is important to listen to people and have individuals define their own sets of expectations, set their own goals and objectives, because that gives them an opportunity to move forward and not to be subjected to an expectation that they're only going to have a bad outcome. Because what one person defines as a bad outcome, somebody else may define as progress. And a lot of people want to know that I can make progress and I could work toward my goal. Going hand in glove with this is that they're often complaining about not being sufficiently informed about and included in treatment decisions. None of us want people simply to do things to us. They want people to include us in decision-making about any care that we might receive. And receiving poor quality mental health services is often something that people who have been in the system have reported feeling stigmatized by. And that separate and unequal systems have really led to a sense that these state-operated or community-operated or now corrections-operated systems are for one class of people, and private health care is for a different class of people. And we need to recognize that everybody is in the same class.
So when we're combating stigma, if you're an individual with a behavioral health diagnosis, it's sometimes begins and ultimately is best accomplished, if it doesn't have to begin there, as an interaction with an individual with a lived experience. That is to say, the best way to combat stigma is to see someone who has had an illness, has recovered from it, is willing to speak about it, and would be able to communicate the fact that their diagnosis of a mental health condition, particularly well treated, where robust sustained remissions allow normal functioning, that's the best testimony for disclosing and getting the best help. I think that's the strongest place you can be. There's certainly social media sites for people who have lived experiences, and people can decide, as we've been talking about, a level of disclosure that's selective and discriminate, and we've been talking about the power and the effect of reducing stigma and disclosing on the quality of life. Paul was mentioning, and this is still very true, that even in mental health settings, in primary care settings, where I do most of my patient care and teaching, there's an incredibly profound lack of understanding, respect, or willingness to speak to the stigma and to understand the hope that's there with best treatment. So one of the things that we do in teaching settings is not only to, again, first look at contact with people with lived experiences, but bring people who are healthcare providers with lived experiences into this conversation, so that people can understand that there are nurses and doctors and social workers and all sorts of people involved in delivering healthcare who have been to some of these dark places and have gotten help and are now living recovered and manageable lives, and giving strength, lending strength and receiving strength from these kinds of interactions. I think workplace materials can play a role in this. Continuing education certainly is there. I used to do a 3-hour seminar with third-year medical students when I was teaching at the university level, where we talked about the fact of mental illness in being present in most of our difficult patient interactions and cases. We talked about interventions. So a contact-based intervention for a healthcare provider would emphasize, you can treat this. These are illnesses that can be treated, and the earlier the treatment, the better. Holy smokes, one of the horrible things about our system of healthcare right now is that we miss these illnesses and the opportunity to treat these illnesses in children and adolescents. And when we fail to make that connection and fail to provide aggressive treatment, we set people up for failure in so many other activities of life. We know now from a number of good studies that mothers who are fully remitted from major depression have healthier children, healthier emotional children. And so treating mothers well is preventing or impacting in a positive way on the children that they have that are possibly genetically at risk. We also want to talk about experiences that peers have, that client educators would have, and we want just to address the variety of factors that drive stigmatizing beliefs. And again, one of those factors is just a lack of awareness of the prevalence of the condition. Another factor is just everyone is, or not everyone, but many people are just hiding or being so secretive about the fact that they have these conditions, and they're just so reluctant to disclose because I don't think they realize the strength that's in disclosure. And again, as I've said probably for the 5th time now, the opportunity to give strength to others in our disclosure.
Thank you, Dr. Manning, for sharing your expertise.